Imagine spending like $1 million to destroy a piece of flying plastic that costs less than a used Honda Civic.
Right.
Now imagine having to do that 1,000 times a day. You might be winning every single battle in the sky, but if you look at the spreadsheet,
Yeah,
you are bleeding to death financially.
exactly.
Today, we're unpacking this honestly terrifying mathematical equation that's currently playing out in the Middle East. And we're exploring how it completely redefines what it means to actually, win a war.
Yeah, because it forces you to throw out the traditional military playbook entirely. I mean, normally both sides in a conflict have a roughly similar definition of victory.
Like capturing a capital or something.
Right, capture the capital, destroying the army, forcing a formal surrender. But when one side is playing for total regime change and the other side's only objective is just simply surviving to see tomorrow, the scoreboard completely breaks.
And understanding that broken scoreboard is our mission for you today. We are diving into a highly provocative piece of analysis from a YouTube channel called The From Report.
Hmm.
Their video essay is titled, "The Miscalculation That Could Cost America Everything in the Middle East." And if you spend any time watching geopolitical analysis online, this video really stands out because it provides an incredibly detailed mechanical look at the architecture of this conflict.
It really does.
The central paradigm-shifting argument they present is pretty straightforward. It's just survival is victory.
But before we go any further into the mechanics of that argument, we need to establish a massive, absolutely crucial baseline for you, the listener.
Yeah, very important.
We are discussing heavily debated, highly sensitive, and politically charged military actions involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran. You need to know right up front that our role today is strictly as analytical guides.
Right.
We are not taking sides, we are not validating the claims made in the source material, and we are certainly not endorsing any political viewpoints.
Exactly. We're just the messengers here.
Right. Our only job is to impartially report and unpack the arguments exactly as they were presented in the From Report so you can understand the underlying logic of their analysis.
We are just holding up a mirror to the video. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the first days of this conflict. Because to understand why survival is victory has become the defining dynamic, we first have to look at how the U.S. and Israel actually designed their original strategy.
Right, the initial plan.
Yeah, the analysis suggests they believed they were going to win quickly. We are talking about a timeline measured in days, not years.
Yeah, the initial military strategy was built around a surgical decapitation strike. And to understand why they thought this would work, you have to look at the dual power structure of the Iranian system.
Okay.
You have the clerical leadership, the Ayatollahs, and then the military apparatus, which is primarily the Revolutionary Guard.
Right.
The objective of this weekend operation was to eliminate the supreme leadership in one sudden, overwhelming blow.
Like a game of chess. I mean, if you take out the king, the game should just be over, right?
That was the calculation. They thought removing the head would immediately trigger massive internal chaos, sever the command and control to the military, and just cause the entire regime to implode.
And on day zero, the technical aspect of that strike actually partially achieved its primary objective. The supreme leader was killed, along with several senior commanders.
Right.
But the intelligence failure here it's just fascinating. The planners treated the regime like a structurally unsound building, like pull the main pillar and the whole thing comes down.
Yeah, but according to the source, it was more like pruning a weed. They cut off the top, expecting the plant to die, but completely failed to model who would immediately grow into that power vacuum.
So if that strike was technically successful on day zero, why are we entering the fifth week of a war that was supposed to end in days?
Well, the source frames this as one of the most significant intelligence blind spots the Western world has witnessed in a generation. The CIA and Mossad essentially predicted that the initial bombardment would serve as a catalyst for a massive popular uprising. They gave the regime a few days, maybe 4 weeks maximum, before total collapse.
But that didn't happen.
No. What they failed to predict was the immediate ascension of Ali Khamenei's son, Mujtaba Khamenei.
And stepping into that role, Mujtaba completely changes the geopolitical calculus. I mean, the profile the video builds of him is critical to understanding the current stalemate.
Right, he's a completely different player.
He is younger, he's considered significantly more hardline than his late father, and most importantly, his roots in the Revolutionary Guard are incredibly deep. The military didn't fracture, it coalesced behind him.
And beyond the structural ties, there is a profound psychological factor the analysis emphasizes here.
Yeah, this part is dark.
It is. On the very first day of this war, as a direct result of that decapitation strike, Mashaba lost his father, his wife, his daughter, his sister, and his brother-in-law.
I mean, just think about that for a second. If you are sitting in a war room trying to negotiate a ceasefire, that detail is staggering.
It changes everything.
You haven't shattered the regime. You've basically handed absolute power to a man who now wakes up every single morning motivated purely by immense personal loss and revenge. You've removed any incentive for compromise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've guaranteed that the leadership is far more willing to absorb catastrophic punishment than the man you originally targeted.
Right.
And that punishment has been severe. The Frum report relays a highly distressing detail from that first day. They note that 175 girls between the ages of 12 and 14 were killed in a primary school during the initial bombardment.
And the video uses that tragic event to ask a very uncomfortable mechanical question about modern warfare. I mean,
Right.
if a military is using GPS-guided precision munitions, which are, the most sophisticated targeting hardware on the planet, how does a primary school full of children at the start of the day get confused with a military bunker?
Well, the source notes that the strike drew immediate international condemnation from the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, and it was featured prominently in Western media like the Washington Post.
Yeah, it was everywhere.
And the video utilizes this to point out a severe lack of accountability in international law when powerful, technologically advanced nations are involved in asymmetrical warfare. It sets a deeply grim tone for the conflict.
It radically alters the diplomatic landscape, too, which makes perfect sense. If you have a new Iranian leadership driven by personal devastation and a public traumatized by civilian casualties, the traditional avenues for diplomacy are essentially bricked up.
They're close.
And yet, diplomatic efforts were actually attempted. The video highlights the Trump administration's 15-point ceasefire proposal, which on paper looks completely detached from the reality on the ground.
Yeah, the proposal demanded the complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, the full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and the severing of all ties with allied militia groups across the region.
Meaning Hezbollah, Palestinian groups, factions in Yemen.
Exactly. All of them.
So it is essentially a demand for unconditional surrender, just dressed up as a peace treaty. It asks Iran to dismantle decades of regional strategy overnight. So, of course, Iran rejected it.
Right.
But if you are watching this unfold, you might wonder, why didn't Iran essentially say, okay, let's at least use this as a starting point? Like, isn't peace the goal here? Why essentially say, you have got to be kidding?
What's fascinating here is how the analysis provides vital context for that rejection. It wasn't just reflexive stubbornness.
Okay.
Before this war even began, Iran had actually been actively negotiating on many of those exact same points. Talks were underway in Oman, and Iran had signaled a clear willingness to reach a diplomatic agreement.
And literally the day after those diplomatic signals were sent, the bombs fell, the decapitation strike happened, the school was hit.
Exactly. Plus, the source reminds us of the historical backdrop. Iran had already agreed to a comprehensive nuclear framework during Trump's first term, a framework that the administration unilaterally tore up. So the logical question the video poses is, why would the Iranian government trust a recycled version of a discarded deal, offered by the exact same administration immediately following weeks of aggressive bombardment?
From an analytical standpoint, the credible guarantee required for diplomacy simply does not exist.
Right. The trust deficit is absolute.
But it's not just the history of broken deals, is it? It's the glaring contradiction happening in real time.
Oh, the military deployments.
Exactly. While floating these 15-point peace proposals, the U.S. is simultaneously flowing massive amounts of hardware and personnel into the region. The video specifically points to a newly announced unit of airborne paratroopers and an expeditionary unit of 2,500 Marines currently en route.
You cannot separate the diplomatic overtures from the military logistics. Presenting a peace proposal in one hand while deploying thousands of Marines with the other, it sends a very clear signal about your actual intentions.
And Iran clearly reads that signal. I mean, they even released a satirical video mocking the Iraq model of occupation.
Which is a crucial concept to define here.
Right.
The Iraq model isn't about winning major tank battles. It's about getting bogged down in endless urban insurgencies, dealing with IEDs and bleeding resources over decades, holding hostile territory.
Iran is broadcasting that they know exactly what those paratroopers are for, and they are ready to turn it into a quagmire. The From report even mentions leaked intelligence showing the late Supreme Leader had a detailed contingency plan written years ago for this exact scenario of a U.S.-Israeli military strike.
And that preparation changes the entire nature of the conflict. Iran isn't improvising a defense, they're executing a long-term strategy.
Yeah.
And because they refuse to surrender, the conflict shifts from a lightning-fast decapitation strike into a brutal war of economic attrition.
Which means we have to look at how a heavily sanctioned country fights back against a vastly superior, technologically advanced military coalition. Here's where it gets really interesting. This is the terrifying mathematical equation we mentioned at the start. When we usually think of warfare, we picture moving lines on a map, capturing territory.
Right, the traditional view.
But the source frames this entirely differently. It is an industrial accounting problem. Let's break down the financial asymmetry here because the math is wild. The video notes that an Iranian drone costs somewhere between $10,000 and $30,000 to produce.
Pennies in military terms.
You're right. They're using commercial off-the-shelf parts, simple moped engines, basic GPS guidance.
Conversely, every American interceptor missile used to shoot down that drone costs roughly $1 million.
$1 million for one missile.
And it's important to understand why that interceptor costs so much. You're paying for decades of defense contractor research, hyper-advanced radar guidance systems, exotic materials, and incredibly complex, slow-moving supply chains.
So you have a $10,000 piece of flying plastic forcing a $1 million response. It's literally like fighting a massive swarm of bees by throwing Rolex watches at them.
That's a great way to put it.
Eventually, you just run out of watches. If you're sitting in the Pentagon, that math should give you a panic attack. It essentially turns the U.S. military's greatest strength, its sophisticated, high-tech defensive shield, into a massive financial liability.
And that is the core of Iran's strategy of attrition. The source estimates Iran has a stockpile of over 80,000 drones.
Wow.
They do not care about winning individual tactical engagements in the sky. If the U.S. intercepts 1,000 drones, Iran considers that a success. Why? Because they just forced the U.S. to burn $1 billion.
And then they just launch 15,000 more.
Exactly. Because the production line for cheap drones is essentially infinite, but the stockpile of million-dollar interceptors is highly finite.
Right.
This brings us to the concept of magazine depth. A military base only has so many launch tubes for its air defense batteries. Once they fire all their interceptors at a massive swarm of cheap drones, reloading isn't instantaneous.
Can't just press a button.
No, it takes time, and it relies on vulnerable logistics networks to bring in more missiles. Iran's strategy is to exhaust those local defense systems, drain the finite reserves, and ultimately bankrupt the defender's supply chain.
And the video claims the strategy is actually working right now. They point out that 13 U.S. military bases in the region have been degraded or forced offline since the conflict began.
Yeah.
And offline doesn't necessarily mean the base was bombed to dust. It means the base depleted its magazine depth.
Exactly. Once the Patriot batteries are empty, the airspace is undefended.
Right, and the personnel have to stand down or evacuate to avoid taking casualties. The U.S. is burning millions daily just to keep the lights on against $10 components.
And that level of financial and logistical exhaustion on the battlefield immediately creates a ticking political clock back in Washington.
Oh, absolutely.
You cannot burn through taxpayer money and finite military hardware at that rate without it bleeding heavily into domestic politics.
And the timelines for the leaders involved are completely out of sync, which is fascinating to watch. The video heavily emphasizes this divergence.
Tell them about the timelines.
Well, on one side, you have Trump, who is staring down midterm elections in October and November. The economic blowback is already hitting American voters. The source notes that domestic gasoline prices have spiked by 30%.
That's huge for voters.
It is. And on top of that, the video cites reported sentiment within the U.S. military, and this is reported, not speculated, that American soldiers feel they are being asked to fight, drain resources, and potentially die for Israeli security interests rather than American strategic goals.
Right.
So Trump desperately needs this war wrapped up before the November elections.
But on the other side of the alliance, you have Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. His political timeline is the exact inverse.
Right.
According to the analysis, his political survival and potentially his freedom from domestic legal issues depends on maintaining a state of emergency. He needs military escalation, not de-escalation, to keep his coalition intact.
Can you give a concrete example of this alliance fracturing? Because they're nominally fighting the same war, but pursuing fundamentally incompatible political objectives.
Yeah. We are actually seeing this fracture play out in real time. The video points to Israel's strike on the South Pars natural gas field, which is a wild strategic move when you look at the mechanics of it.
Why is that?
Well, the South Pars field is one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world. But crucially, it is shared by Iran and Qatar.
Ah.
And Qatar is a massive non-NATO ally to the United States. They host the Al Udeid Air Base, which is the forward headquarters for U.S. Central Command. By striking shared infrastructure, Israel wasn't just hitting Iran. They risked dragging a vital U.S. partner, and by extension the U.S. military, into a wider regional crossfire.
Which perfectly explains why the White House immediately threw their hands up and publicly distanced themselves.
Exactly.
Trump stated publicly that Israel acted alone, that the U.S. was not informed in advance, and that it wouldn't happen again. The senior partner is publicly disclaiming responsibility for the junior partner's actions.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the analysis highlights the brilliance of this dynamic from Iran's perspective.
Okay.
Iran doesn't need to defeat Israel militarily, they just need to exploit the fracture in the alliance. Every time Israel strikes energy infrastructure, it drives up global oil prices.
And that 30% spike at the gas pump directly hurts American consumers.
Which costs Trump votes at home. Iran is effectively weaponizing the American election cycle. They just need to keep launching cheap drones, let energy prices climb, and let the calendar tick toward November.
So under the crushing weight of this political and economic pressure, how does the Frum report predict this conflict actually resolves?
The analysts outline two primary endgames. The first is what they term a simulated victory.
A simulated victory. Essentially, everyone agrees to lie about what just happened so they can go home.
That is the pragmatic reality of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an outcome where both sides declare they've achieved their goals, even if the reality on the ground is highly ambiguous.
How does that work?
Well, the U.S. and Israel announced they successfully degraded Iran's nuclear infrastructure and eliminated the leadership threat, presenting it as a massive win. Simultaneously, Iran declares a historic generational triumph simply because it survived a massive, sustained assault from the world's premier military superpower.
So they sign a deal that looks suspiciously similar to the one they were negotiating in Oman before the war started, and everyone packages a carefully curated narrative to sell to their domestic audiences.
Exactly. Nobody admits the massive gap between the regime collapse promised on day one and the stalemate achieved in week 5.
It is deeply unsatisfying from a strategic standpoint, but historically, it is often how wars of attrition between unequal powers conclude.
It is. However, the video paints a second, much more destabilizing scenario: a full U.S. pullback.
Which means what, exactly?
If the domestic political cost simply becomes too toxic, gas prices are too high, the midterms are slipping away, Trump might conclude that Netanyahu is dragging the U.S. into an endless quagmire. The U.S. significantly reduces its involvement or withdraws its protective umbrella entirely.
Which leaves Israel fighting alone. And the demographic and geographic math there is stark.
It is.
It places Israel, a country of 9 million people, in a protracted war against Iran, a nation of 90 million. Israel would be fighting without the magazine depth of U.S. bases, without coalition air support, against an enemy that has already demonstrated it can penetrate advanced air defense networks with sheer volume.
And the video draws a parallel to Syria here.
Yeah.
It envisions a scenario where the Iranian regime survives over a ruined, battered country.
Wow.
They're under siege, their infrastructure is heavily damaged, but they're still governing. And under their specific strategic logic, surviving over ruins is still a definitive victory compared to regime collapse.
And while these two scenarios are playing out, while the U.S. is burning millions of dollars a day and fracturing its alliances, there are silent observers meticulously watching every single development on the global stage.
Yes, the video heavily emphasizes the roles of China and Russia here.
This might be the most consequential part of the entire analysis. Because China isn't just sitting back eating popcorn, they are aggressively gathering telemetry.
Right.
They are studying this war as a live fire laboratory for how to defeat the United States military.
Exactly. They're mapping every vulnerability the U.S. exposes in real time. When a U.S. carrier strike group deploys, China is analyzing its logistics chains. They are monitoring the radar frequencies used by the Patriot batteries. They are noting exactly how many drones it takes to overwhelm a specific defense tier.
And analyzing the deployment cycles of advanced assets like the F-35 under sustained stress.
Yes, they are essentially watching the U.S. write the manual on its own limitations.
And what happens if Iran survives this, under either the simulated victory or the ruins scenario?
Well, the Frum report asserts that if Iran survives, China and Russia will move immediately to rebuild and heavily arm the country to unprecedented levels.
Really?
Yes. And this wouldn't be a slow diplomatic process. The strategic goal would be to create a permanent, heavily armed Middle Eastern counterweight to U.S. influence.
The video actually compares it to why the U.S. armed Taiwan. If China can turn Iran into a permanent, highly capable thorn in the side of the U.S. in the Middle East, the U.S. will be forced to keep its finite resources, its interceptors, and its carrier groups tied down defending the Persian Gulf.
Which means the U.S. cannot pivot those resources to the Pacific to counter China's ambitions. While the U.S. and its allies are bleeding resources, draining their treasuries, and drowning in domestic energy crises.
China is simply taking notes.
Taking notes, manufacturing cheap drones, and preparing the geopolitical chessboard for the next 50 years.
Which brings us all the way back to the core thesis of the video. Survival is victory. For the U.S. and Israel, victory required a massive structural change regime collapse, the end of the Ayatollah system, the total dismantlement of a nation's defense capabilities.
Right.
But for Iran, victory just means still being there when the smoke clears, still governing, still launching drones. So what does this all mean?
Yeah.
According to the From Report's mechanical analysis, as they enter the fifth week of a war that was supposed to last a single weekend, Iran's definition of victory is looking far more mathematically achievable than the alternative.
It forces a complete reevaluation of modern military power. And it leaves us with a profound, lingering question inspired by this source material.
Yeah.
Think about it. The United States spent the last 70 years building global military dominance based on the projection of overwhelming high-tech force.
But if that overwhelming force can be stalled, financially drained, and potentially bankrupted by simple asymmetric swarm tactics and an adversary whose only goal is simply not to quit, you have to wonder, are we witnessing the end of the traditional military empire?
It's a huge question.
How do superpowers project influence in a future where a $10 component can completely neutralize a $10 million system?
It is a question that completely breaks the old scoreboard, and the answer will likely define the next century of global geopolitics.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the From Report's analysis. As always, keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you, keep looking at how the rules of the game are changing, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks for watching Warlens Reports. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned.
Your support keeps us going. See you next time.